Hey guys, Yamakiller here, back again with another, slideshow presentation. The series is continuing. Been a couple weeks off, but we're back on the grind, giving you another nice presentation on a topic that I wanted to talk about. Before we get into it, I've got a couple things to say. One, my throat is a little bit sore, but I did want to get this out on schedule, so I'm sorry if I have a little bit of coughing or I'm not talking as clearly as necessary, but I will try my best to persevere and get through. Should be around 20 to 30 minutes, so it shouldn't be too rough on my throat. Drank some tea before, and that should help. Second, if you guys like my content at all, really appreciate a subscribe to the channel, liking the videos, all these things that are free for you guys to do and help me out a lot, following me on my Twitch, following me on my Twitter, etc. I don't ask for any of the paid stuff too often, but for the freebies, I do appreciate them a lot. And third, if you guys like these videos, there's more of them in the playlist of MTG deep dives and all these things, and I would really love to hear some feedback on what you liked, what you didn't like, etc. I'm still trying to iterate on this process and give you guys content that you guys both like and is good and that I enjoy making as well. All those things together make something that everyone likes. So, all that being said, let us get into the true meat of the content today. That is presentation on why control should never be tier 1. Now, what I mean by tier 1 is a deck that is the top of the top. Maybe better to say tier 0 or tier 0.5. Something that is like, okay, you are going to a tournament and you expect this is the deck to be played. This is the deck to beat. And it's something that is widely known, widely popular, and widely played. I'm going to go over my points of what a tier 1 control deck looks like. I'm going to go over why I think it is bad for decks to be tier 1, the history of certain tier 1 control decks in multiple formats, and what their problematic nature was for the format, and just generalizing why I think control should never be tier 1. Maybe a bit of hyperbole in the title, but what I'm trying to express to the opinion that control, while it necessarily shouldn't necessarily be tier 1, what a control deck that I think is healthy for the format and I think that is good for the format to be around and what it should look like. So, when we thinking of a tier 1 deck, when I'm thinking of like the tier 1 decks of recent time, especially for control in multiple formats, Oko and Uro, these blue-green menaces really contributed to certain decks really getting over the top, becoming the best decks of the formats, and usually they go in more controlling shells because they accrue advantage over a long period of time. So, what more do you want for a control deck than some of these broken threats? And so, like, what does a tier 1 control deck look like? I think there's a few different things that go into a tier 1 control deck, and the first is win conditions that are hard to interact with and take over the game. Among which I just said, Oko, Uro, sometimes it's Jace the Mind Sculptor. Usually planeswalkers are permanents that accrue loads of advantage both quickly. If they're dealt with, it takes usually a 2-for-1, if not more than that, and sometimes you are trading down on mana or trading down on cards, especially to deal with these, and they're not traditionally interactable with or hard to interact with without them accruing enough advantage to really make it hard for you to come back into the game. Answers that are both broad and good, a cheap counterspell, something like actual factual counterspell, good removal spells, Lightning Bolt, Fatal Push, Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares. These cards come to mind that are both good and broad, sweepers that are cheap and easy to use, Terminus, Supreme Verdict, things that are not necessarily easy to interact with, but are good across the spectrum of things that people are usually doing. If you're playing against creatures, Terminus is great, 1 mana, deals with everything, because they're both good, and broad to deal with multiple different threats. Attempting to go to the mid and the long game, not an option. Look at Feel the Dead in Modern, look at Uro and Oko trying to play long games against them, Jace the Mind Sculptor. Some other threats, 5 mana to Fairy in Standard, where, you were just, every single turn that's going on, you're getting deeper and deeper into this card disadvantage state when you're playing against it, and you don't want to be going long against these decks, which is traditional for control decks that are tier 1 and at the top of their game. So let's look at some of the past tier 1 control decks that have happened. I'm going to take Blue-White Miracles from one Onzi D, very, very good control player over the long period of legacy that he's been playing. This deck has many, many different problematic parts to it that really made it so people really did not enjoy playing against this deck, and eventually, got cards banned from this deck because they were so good and so annoying and not fun to play against. So Miracles quickly locks you out from playing spells, counterbalance, an enchantment that looks at the top of your deck, if your opponent's spell is the same CMC as the top of your deck, it counters it. When you have the lock of Sensitive Divining Top plus counterbalance, your opponent can no longer play 1-mana spells. They'll always get countered, and you can likely keep them out of 2, 3s, and 4s fairly easily as well. You had a cheap instant speed sweeper in Terminus. It sweeped the whole board, hard to interact with, hard to stop because you couldn't deal with it through traditional means of a Thoughtseize or a Duress, which a lot of black-based mid-range decks would deal with sweepers in such a way, because it's always coming from the top of the deck. And you had Lockout plus Inevitability with JTMS looking at the top card of your deck and making it so that you're never going to have a good draw ever again. So this deck was not very fun to play against, in my personal opinion, and opinions of a lot of different people before this deck was banned. You had Prison Elements and Countertop. A lot of these control decks that are at the top have Prison Elements in the sense that they're trying to lock you out of the game. It's not that you're trying to accrue a small advantage over time like something like a mid-range deck or some mid-rangey aggro type stuff dealing, and you're never dealing in like creature combat really. You're doing a few things. You got Prison Elements in the sense that, okay, I'm going to counter every single spell you play from here on out. I'm going to remove every single creature you have from here on out. You're never going to gain advantage, and you're going to be locked out from doing anything meaningful. There's never going to be, the combat step does not exist for you anymore. And your spells that are going to get you any advantage, try and pull ahead of my card advantage spells, are never going to resolve. And you're really just, you're locked out of the game in a way that is not interesting or exciting, and you can't really pull your way back in these spots most of the time. You have a looming, easily found cheap Mass Sweeper. When you have to play to the board, and you have to play to try to kill your opponent quicker because you know that their end game is going to beat you. When you have this looming threat that's like, okay, off the top, randomly, it could both be random or not in the form of Terminus, my entire board is going to be swept, and they're going to be having ways to set it up very easily in ways that I can't necessarily interact with because it's a card from the top of their deck. I can't really interact with the deck itself very easily. And, another part of Miracles that wasn't very fun, it had one of the slowest cards in existence in Sensei's Divining Top. If you ever played in this era, Sensei's Divining Top, when you were playing against players who were not incredibly experienced with the deck, it was a drag. It would take forever. And largely, a lot of the times, especially in paper, you could play towards draws or play towards your opponent timing out in spots where they wouldn't necessarily have done that in other circumstances, just because this card was incredibly slow and methodical for people to play. So, past Miracles, that was a legacy deck. Let's look at more recent modern decks. This is from 2020. You had the Uro Omnath deck. We're going to be looking at McWinsauce, another great control player who's played control over many, many years in multiple formats and had lots of success. This deck made a lot of people stop playing Modern, in my experience. I talked to a bunch of people during this time. I played a bunch of Modern during this time. And this deck was miserable to play against. You had many, many quote-unquote fire cards, Renin 6, Uro, Omnath, Force of Negation. These cards that are just like, they accrue so much advantage and they're difficult to interact with, and they need so many specific different pieces of interaction. It was just like incredibly unfun. And even if you did try and interact with them, like, okay, I'm going to slow down the Uro, I'm going to slow down, the Planeswalkers, they could still just have Field of the Dead at the end of the day and land. You have to deal with creatures, Planeswalkers, lands. It's so many different things to deal with while they're also, have counter spells. They've got good removal spells. It's so many different things to deal with. So, it attacked from multiple angles, as I said. Lands and Field of the Dead, creatures in Uro and Omnath, Planeswalkers in Renin 6 and like Teferi and Jace. You also had one of the most awful experiences in Modern. Similar to Countertop, you had Mystic Sanctuary Lockout, where you could go Cryptic Command, counter your spell, bounce Mystic Sanctuary, replay Mystic Sanctuary, put Cryptic to the top. I'm going to counter every single spell you have for the rest of the game. And with Uro out, I'm going to gain life, I'm going to draw those Cryptic Commands repeatedly, and I'm going to continue to just make sure that you don't get to play the game. As I said, Prison Elements are something that is really continuing to happen in these control decks that are at the top of the top. You don't have any opportunity to get out from under them once they get their lock going, and the lock happens relatively quickly. So, the gripes for the decks, maximum fire cards, you got Renin 6, Uro, etc., etc. They got to play, with all the best spells, basically, because they were a 4-color deck with Omnath. You got so much different mana, you have a bunch of lands with Renin 6 and fetch lands and such, and you had Field of the Dead. You got to play 4 colors and 2 colorless lands in your deck, and it was pretty absurd. And as I said, let you play every color. The advent of Tri-lands that had been printed recently at that time really, activated a bunch of different mana possibilities within the deck as well. So, let's look at one more deck. Before then, You had Arkham's Astrolabe and Oko Thief Crowns, once again by McWinsauce in Modern. 2020, not the greatest year for Modern. Lots and lots of different control decks at the top, which, not necessarily a dig on control, but a dig on these cards that have been printed that have helped out control. But, there's also examples from the past, as I said, with top and counterbalance. But with Oko Astrolabe, mana was not an issue. It brought control. Before this, there was basically no control decks that were doing well. And then Arkham's Astrolabe and Oko came out. Oko, one of the best planeswalkers of all time, incredibly controlling card. Astrolabe, one of the best cantrips plus mana fixers all at once. It really, brought the deck up and really, made a lot of traditional control hate cards, like Choke, Boil, possibly some other cards that really restricted their mana at times was not present. So, what do these decks all have in common, as I talked about? Prison Elements, Oko Astrolabe. Once Oko comes down, if you do not have an immediate answer, you're going to be slowly drained out by that card. Your creatures don't matter, your permanents don't matter. Oko is the ruler of all. You got Counterbalance top, you got Mystic Sanctuary, Cryptic Command. These prison elements that just are not fun. It's not fun to get Chalice of the Void and Snaring Bridge, but, while it looks different in Cryptic Command and Terminus and all these sweepers and counterspells, they feel the same way in that you think that you have a chance, but you really don't. Like, you're not going to resolve a spell. You're not going to be able to get into combat. These things are going to stop you. It just doesn't quite look the same. People don't think of it the same way as, a Chalice of the Void and the Snaring Bridge, a Trinisphere. But they are kind of the same in that they're prisoning you and they're making it so that you do not get to play the game in the way that traditionally it is played. Your removal spells don't matter. Your creatures don't matter. They're going to get removed and your spells are going to get countered. And this is going to happen to you relatively quickly in these decks because that's the goal of them and that's why they're so good. They're going to make it so you don't get to play the game very, very quickly. Push cards and Broken Synergy, as I said, Broken Synergy and top counterbalance, Oko Astrolabe, Uro, Omnath, all these push cards, and Inevitable and Unbeatable late game, all these cards come together, once again, are coming together to make an Inevitable and Unbeatable late game because you can't beat these cards because they accrue so much advantage just by playing them. And even if you're playing cards to deal with these cards that are incredible advantage, you're losing out on either mana or cards while doing so, and they're just, continuing to eat up every single resource that you could possibly have to deal with them. So, why these decks are too much? People like a back and forth game. Look at mid-range games when it's mid-range versus mid-range, You don't necessarily know who's going to come out on top. There's complex board states where you have to deal with attacking and blocking and planeswalker activations and, what sort of advantage do I want to accrue? Do I want to accrue advantage on the life total? Do I want to accrue advantage on the cards in hand? Do I want to potentially deal with their graveyard? Do I want to deal with my graveyard? All these different axes that we're playing on that the control decks don't try to play on. Creature combat, non-existent. Planeswalkers, it's protect the king on their side, and their planeswalkers are so good they're going to just be unbeatable. It's these back and forths that don't necessarily happen with control decks because it's, I'm going to play out my creatures. Okay, the sweeper happened. I've lost the game, or things like this. These ever-looming threats that aren't necessarily present in these other games. When your opponent has Uro in their deck, you're like, okay, I'm going to play the game. Oh, Uro came down. Okay, I've lost. Okay, Oko came down. Okay, it's insurmountable lead, and it happened so early. And these threats are ever looming in your head. You're like, okay, there's not really that good of answers to them in a lot of formats, and you just have to accept the fact that once they come down, you're going to lose the game, because not only are there not that great of answers, they've got very good answers to whatever potential answers you have, because they have counterspells, they've got good removal spells, they've got good sweepers. These things that are going to be difficult for you to deal with. And face roll cards, as I'm saying, Uro and Omnath that just play my card, okay, game over. Or, cards that just, you can almost mindlessly play them and you'll probably just win the game. So, not only are when you play against these decks, it feels bad because you're getting locked out so quickly, these decks breed something in the metagame that is really, really bad. Because a lot of the decks that come out when control decks are the best are decks that say, okay, if I can't beat these advantageous cards, I can't beat these counterspells and all these things going long into the game because they're going to outcard me. They're going to stop me from playing cards very quickly in the game. What can I do to defeat this? Play decks that kill them before they can set up anything of relevance. So if a game gets out of reach by turn 4 by a Jace the Mind Sculptor and escaped Uro, Omnath, some of these cards, just kill them on turn 3. You can also go with blowout sideboard cards. You know, if I'm going to not be able to play the game, what better than to make it so they don't get to play the game as well? Play something like Boil, play something like Choke. They don't get to play, if they don't have lands, they don't get to play the game. If I'm playing some uncounterable, indestructible Hexproof threat that it has no way to be interacted with, they're not going to be able to play it. They're not going to be able to play the game because I'm going to just win. And the mirror also, games get inbred. This is, for any tier 1 / tier 0 deck, games get inbred. And specifically for control and paper, games go to time and you have to wait an hour 15, hour 20 minutes, or even longer for matches to complete. And that is no fun for anyone. So I say tier is too slow. You try to play all in combo decks that do not try to interact. Belcher, Oops All spells, old Hammer Time decks that would try to kill you as quickly as possible. Dredge, Sneak and Show, all in mono red aggro. Try and kill your opponent as quickly as possible so their cards that gain them advantage, they can't even play them. They just cannot play their cards because they're just dead so early. And people can say, oh, that's just a part of the metagame, but I think these decks are incredibly unfun to play against a lot of the time. Mono red not so much as something like Belcher, Dredge, and Oops All spells that are just sideboard lotteries. They're like, okay, I'll bring in my 4 Leonine Voids, hope I have them in my hand. Belcher, hope I drew a Force Will or 2. Oops All spells, hope I got the right interaction. Because that's not fun to really play those side. I mean, some people say Belcher's got a lot of thought to it. Let me think. Sodek is a play that said Dredge is really complicated. It's really hard. You have to think a lot. There's lots of play to it. It's like, and then you just see him go, oh, the Faithless Looting, Cathartic Union, whoops, won the game. You didn't get to do anything. And it's just not very fun gameplay. It's not very fun things to have happen. It's not very fun things to do, usually when you're playing against these decks. And, card advantage is nothing compared to winning. If you're winning on turn 2 with Oops All spells, doesn't matter that you have Uro. Doesn't matter that you have Jace the Mind Sculptor. Those cards don't matter because I won the game on turn 2. So let's also talk about blowout cards. These are the cards that I said, Boil, Choke, etc. that are cards that you just try to draw and play. You're like, okay, if I get to resolve Boil, they don't have lands in play. I could probably win if they don't have lands in play. So I'm going to play this card that just makes so my opponent doesn't get to play the game. Those cards are also not very fun to play against because they're really black and white cards in the sense that you play it and it resolves, your opponent doesn't get to play the game. Okay, if I have to play a card so drastic as Boil or Choke, and when they get countered, most likely I'm not playing the game because the game's over because I needed such a drastic card in the matchup to really make it so that they can't play it either because I cannot win a game in which that they're playing most of the time. So it's just not fun to play these cards that are just like, okay, win the game. Like, it makes sense more in a matchup that's like, let's say, mono red versus blue-white control if someone has circle protection red, or let's say Oops All spells versus some controlling deck and they have Rest in Peace. That's a little bit different because it's an all-in combo deck. You expect to, have these one-hit KO cards because they're, trying to hit one-hit KO you as well. When you see Boil and Choke in these one-hit KO cards out of mid-range decks or potentially like aggro-leaning decks, it's really not where you want things to be. You want things to be ebb and flow. You want back and forth. You don't want I win or I lose cards because those are not particularly fun to do. They're not very complex, challenging for deck building or gameplay. It's just kind of, as I call the face roll cards. That's just, okay, play my spell. Oh, you didn't have an answer to it. You dead. Game over. Those things are not very fun to have happen. Inbred Mirror. Let's look at main deck cards. Pyroblast. More force negations, more whatever types of cards that are anti-control cards, and you're playing them in the main deck. You really do not want Inbred Mirrors. Card or matches going to super long. These things are not very fun, especially Inbred Mirrors of any decks, but of control decks, they're particularly not fun in my opinion as well. So, with all that being said, what I don't like about the Tier 1 control deck, what is a control deck that I think looks good in metagame, that's fun, that I think that is interesting? It's a deck that targets metagame inefficiencies. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say the top deck is Infect. And you can build a tap-out control deck of some sort, or a control deck that's like, okay, 4 Fatal Pushes, 4 Lightning Bolts, like a bunch of removal spells. That is very, very controlling, and you have some sort of way to win at the end. Who knows what it is? Maybe it's a Jace, maybe it's like some Baneslayer Angels, some way to win the game. But you're exploiting the fact that there's this creature deck that's just mono creatures and trying to kill you with a couple different creatures. You're like, okay, I'm gonna exploit this by just playing 20 different removal spells that are all cheap and are, circumstantial potentially, but they're all incredibly good against Glistener Elf and Blighted Agent and, Inkmoth Nexus. So that's a way to exploit a metagame inefficiency. So has good and bad matchups. You don't want your cards to all just be, all my cards are good all the time, no matter what. I'm going to have Counterspell into my Uro, into my Teferi, and all my cards are great, and none of my cards are circumstantial, none of my cards are bad, and I didn't have to really think about how to build my deck because all my cards are great. There's no bad cards in my deck. And that's not very fun. You want to have the deck building thought of, okay, I'm going to put these specific cards in my deck because it is good against these specific decks. I understand I am taking a hit on these other matchups, but that's the way that I have to build my deck, because that is, if I wanted to control the game, I need to have my answers and my threats be circumstantial to what is happening in the metagame, and I can change that week to week to better fit myself. I don't just want to have this, okay, I have these cards, this is the way it works, and I just get to deal with any threat or any possible card that my opponent could send at my way. That is not particularly interesting or fun. And then, not centralized win conditions. You don't just want to go like, okay, I'm building my blue control deck, Jason Mind Sculpture is my answer. That's every single time I win condition. Sometimes you want to have something like a big creature that's your win condition, Elder Gargaroth, a Baneslayer Angel. Sometimes you want to have it be a Planeswalker. Sometimes it is Jason Mind Sculpture. Sometimes it's Teferi. Sometimes it's these Planeswalker threats that aren't necessarily easily interactable by the removal or cards that opponent's playing. But you want to have these, sometimes it's an enchantment, some card that's a 5 mana enchantment, I can't remember the green card, but it makes a 2/2 and then turns into a 4/4 and then an 8/8, etc., etc., because it goes sideswipes the traditional ways to deal with the threats in Pyroblast and such. You want to have these threats that are non-traditional because you realize, okay, these are the way that people are playing answers. I'm going to sidestep that with an enchantment, or I'm going to sidestep that with a creature, I'm going to sidestep that with a Planeswalker, and you change it week to week or month to month based on how people are building their decks, how people are building their sideboards. You want the control decks to be one step ahead because you realize, okay, these are the parameters in which I have to be controlling, and this is how I'm going to build my deck. And you want to be having people be rewarded for dealing with certain parameters, what they expect to be the parameters to be, and not just, okay, I'm going to play these cards, and my opponent actually cannot deal with my cards, and I just got to deal with all their threats no matter what, and there's nothing they can do about it. So, control decks at their best, as I said, targets and metagames, not overly dominant, changes colors, answers, threats, shifts, all these things that I'm continually talking about. And, before we actually get into my final thing, it's important to have all these things go together, because if it's not, you're going to be looking at these old decks that are just, okay, I'm going to be playing the 4 best sweeper, I'm going to be playing, my countertop, I'm going to play my Uro Omnath, I'm going to play these prison elements and things that just don't allow my opponent to play. You want a back and forth. When you don't have back and forth in games of Magic and you just have one person face rolling another, I personally think it's not fun, not interactive in a way that is enjoyable, and just kind of unenjoyable. And that's why I think certain tier 1 decks should not be specifically control decks that have these elements that are not particularly fun to play against. And with all that being said, let's get into my final thing. I actually won my first ever MTGO event with a control deck. Was it tier 1? No, people thought this deck was tier 2, possibly even tier 3. But I played this deck, and I went 10-0 in an event, and I won, and I was very happy. This deck dealt with some things that people were not thinking about. People were very into creature removal and very into heavily attacking on the creature front, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to play 2 Snapcasts, 2 Wallbones, very little creatures. I'm going to play these Planeswalker threats, high loyalty count, hard to take off the battlefield. I'm going to play some of these possibly weird interaction points, spreading seas, attack people's mana bases that are possibly getting a little bit greedy. Things like this. This is a perfect control deck that I would love to be in the metagame. Attacks in a way that people do not expect, necessarily. Attacks in a way that really targets how a metagame is turning, and you can change your deck and how it looks like when your opponents are changing how their decks look like. I think one of the blue-eye control decks that's going around right now is a perfect example of that, except for it has some extra, fire cards that I'm not too happy with. But, this is my idea of a perfect control deck that can do well, but it's not overly dominant. And with all that being said, I hope you guys liked what I had to say. I hope you guys understand why I think control decks should not necessarily be the tier 1 decks of the format. I I hope you guys enjoyed what I had to say. If you guys enjoyed it, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'll say it again at the end. I would love for you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and really, I would appreciate all that. And maybe follow my Twitch and Twitter in the description below. All those things be greatly appreciative of. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it and talking with you guys. Thank you guys, and I'll see you guys next Sunday for another one. Bye-bye.